charged to operate, Ron.
Great. I'm having sound trouble too.
Oh, what's the problem? Pinning?
These two memorial. And see, in this area now, just above us here is the Keebler people and the Nabisco people, which are good union shops up there now. When the Elses were in their heyday, I don't think they would have permitted that to happen.
How would they have prevented it?
How?
Yes.
They probably would have had to have a zoning to put up the factory, and they would have gotten word out to the owners of Nabisco and those people that this was the wrong location. Here's an old church here. This was probably one of them that was financed by the Elsa's family. All right. See, here's the old Oakland Cemetery.
You have to talk only about the things that are on your left, because we're not seeing the things on your right.
Okay, on the left.
That's right.
Well, I'm going the wrong way. We'll get to it.
You can always turn, do one and come back and carol the other way.
Oakland Cemetery, and that's the oldest cemetery. That's where Margaret Mitchell is buried, and where the first settlers in this end of the world are buried. All right, you see this store right here on the corner?
Sorry, sir, but we can't talk about things on your right.
I can get it on this side.
Okay, all right, go ahead. No.
That's where we had our meetings, right in there. But this store has been rebuilt. You follow me?
Yes.
It was not brick then, and this was inside the village. We wouldn't dare come in here. We would not dare come in here, and the reason we wouldn't is because this was the Elsa's family, and it was patrolled by the Pinkerton people. Yeah, now here's where Little's place is. This is one of the grocers who was friendly to us. This is his place right here, and that's where some of them would spend time in there.
Not getting it again.
Deal with it, okay? Just deal with it.
Huh?
Let's see if this goes through. Oh, here's where we go. Remember I told you that the Pinkerton people were housed to the left here is where they did their housing. And if you notice, right across the street from us is where the cemetery is, and here's where the housing was done, right here. You see these two? There was some more that well, this one here has come down. I remember there was another one, which was a third one. Now, we were able to meet in that place, but I'm going to show you right here. I'm going to turn to the left here if I can. See where this area is right here? At one time, there were some houses that faced here, and between these houses, there was a space where one had not been built. And I would say that where we're turning now is approximately the spot where it was. I'm going to swing around here. Right here. When we first tried to organize the people, see where it says the sign there, M. Ella King Jr. Historic Site? There was a little area in here, and we held one of our first meetings here. And this was where the people who came out of the mill would be heading back this way to go into some of these houses. And of course, it was easy to attract attention. In addition to that, we were not sure whether or not at first the Elsa's property ran all the way back to Memorial Drive. We found out it did, by the way, because they ordered us off when we wouldn't get off, while they got the police after us and the Pinkerton people after us, and we had to move away from it. That's when it was that we then turned around and began meeting in that corner store that I told you that belonged to one of our people who owned the property there, and we continued to meet there during the entire period of time. And they,
Okay, let's hold it just a moment.
okay, what we're looking at straight ahead are those two houses, and there at one time was a third one, is where the Pinkerton people were housed during the time of the strike. And if you notice, just beyond is the old Elsa's Mill. And the Elsa's Mill was a bag and cotton mill, which was at the low end of the production. In other words, where they did not have to have any tremendous skills like some of the weave mills that were making cloth and something other than gray goods. And then as you come around to the right where you're on Carroll Street, it was down that street that we had a house that belonged to, or a little building that belonged to one of our people, and where we held a number of our meetings there. And then right here, where in this area where we're standing, was where we held the first meeting. And we held it right off the sidewalk here. And a man named Judd was the organizer who was here, and he was the one. We had built some crates up for him to stand on, and he was talking there. And before he got very much said, the Pinkerton people were here, and they had the Atlanta police force down here and told us that we were on private property. We had understood that this did not belong to the Elsas, but belonged to somebody else. And that's why we thought we could get away with holding a meeting out here in the open. They wouldn't let us do it. They claimed that it was the Elsas people. The police verified it was the Elsas people. They broke up our meeting. I don't have to tell you, though, before they broke it up, by the time they did, we had a tremendous crowd. If the police had not been here, we wouldn't have had as big a crowd, because they would have gone on. Then we used to come down this street, and we used to try to engage the people coming out of the mill in conversation about the union. And for a while, we were able to do it, and we were able to give them some of our literature. But then the company decided that that wouldn't do, so they would start their supervisors and the superintendents and have them walk down here. And as they would walk down here, of course, the people would be frightened to take any of our literature. They were afraid to talk with us, and as a result, why we weren't able to do very much with them. This was a real hard place to do much with, because the Elsa's family was paternalistic. They used to say that the Elsa's people would, somebody in the Elsa's family would be through the mill once a day. In other words, they'd walk through for whatever reasons, and when they did, it's, hello, how are you? What about your daughter? Is she well now? What about that little grandson of yours? And it was all this effort to set up a close relationship with their hands, so that the loyalty would be on a personal basis. And the Elsas did that over a real long period of time, as long as they were here. And of course, this was their mill village, and this followed the same pattern that the other mill villages did, and that is that the rent was low, they rented it to their people, they paid by the room and things of that kind.
Hold it, Jamie. I'm going to suggest now we move right up to the behind the old mill. The meetings.
Yes.
What happened? How they got the Pinkertons and so forth and so on.
There we go. Okay, rolling.
When we started holding our meetings here at Fulton Bag, we knew that we would have a problem as to where to hold them. So we held it first close to Memorial Drive and on Boulevard at a place that we thought did not belong to the Elses. And then when we started our first meeting, well, that's when it was that the Pinkerton people came down and some of the supervisors came down, and they made us move away from there. We had disputed with them as to whether or not the Elses owned it at the time, and they claimed they did, and the Atlanta police were able to show us that they did. As a result of it, we then moved further down on Carroll Street, where one of our people owned a little place, and that's where we held our meetings. Now, within sight of it there on Boulevard was where the Pinkertons were stationed in the 2 3-story buildings there. There were 3 of them at the time, and the Pinkerton people could that way command most of the rim on that side of the Mill Village. In addition to that, that's where main traffic went through. The people used to come that way to go back to their homes. We did all right for a while in giving out some literature, but our problem then developed because the supervisors started walking out there with them, and the people were afraid to get anything from us or to even talk to us, even though we tried to talk to them on the street. Now, where we're at now, of course, is where the Mill Village was and the factory, and you notice there have been a lot of changes made because they have closed these windows up. At one time, these were open windows. When they put air conditioning in, why they had to block them out in order to keep the air in. And you see that that made quite a change. And the same thing, it applies all the way back to what I call the steeple, which is usually the stairwell where the people would run in and out from it. In addition to that, we are facing towards that steeple where the railroad track is. That's the railroad where the materials were brought in, the raw material, the cottons were brought into the plant together with all the other supplies, and then when they had their shipments, well, the shipments also went out. This was the main track of the railroad system that was running towards the coast, and this is the same railroad system that Sherman marched down when he marched through Atlanta and burned most of Atlanta and marched on towards Savannah and some of the historic battles that we had in the war between the states.
Joe Jacobs.
I'm Mayor Estella Bryant, the mayor of Cabbagetown. I was
Wow,
elected
yeah.
in by the people for the people in 1967. They won't let me leave.
Oh, they won't.
I've been in Cabbagetown ever since 1965.
Well, that's pretty good. That's for at least a good period of time, but I've been around here lots longer than you have then.
That's right. I've raised 2 children up here.
How did you come to Cabbagetown?
Well, my husband lived up here when he was 14 years old.
Yes.
And then he moved away, and then we moved back up here. And I've
see.
been up here ever since 65, and I don't want to leave.
There you
we
go.
love Cabbagetown.
Good. Did you ever work at the mill when
No,
the
sir, I
Elses
never
were
did.
here? Never did?
No, sir.
So you never had a taste of it, did you?
No, sir.
And it's a lot of change since
Yeah,
then
but
too,
I've
isn't
worked
it?
in the community
Right.
ever since
Where do most of the people live now?
Well,
work now?
Most of them's living on Social Security.
Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And those that work, where do they work?
Well, they work at different jobs.
Yeah, like what?
Well, they work at, some of them works at Atlanta Dairies, you know, and they,
Yeah, which is just down the street.
yes, sir.
Uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
How about over at the bakery that's a little further down?
They closed that bakery up.
They've closed it?
Yes, sir. They
Is
closed
that
it
right?
up years ago.
Well, that used to be a real good
It
place
was a
to
real
work.
good place, yes,
yeah,
sir.
real good place.
Yes, sir. We all worked
And then they used to have the mattress factory down the street
Daniel
too.
Mattress
That's
Factory,
right.
yes, sir.
And then Simmons used to be
Yes,
down there. That
uh-huh.
probably was before your time, though.
No,
Was Simmons still there?
Yes, sir, when
I
we
see.
moved up here.
Are they still operating it there, or have they
No,
closed
they
that?
moved out on Stewart Avenue.
Yeah, well, that was the new place that they set up.
Uh-huh.
Just like they had one over on North Avenue.
Uh-huh.
And then they had this
Yeah,
other one at Stewart.
They moved out on Stewart Avenue.
Well, good. So you like living here?
Oh, yeah, you can't get me away. I raised 2 children,
Yeah.
and they'll be 29 years old the 30th of August. And now I have my 4 grandchildren, and I'm raising them.
Well, good.
Yeah.
And what do your children do?
Well, one works for Jenkins, sheet metal over.
Kind of hide the wire that's hanging out from under his tie.
We don't see it. We don't see
All
it.
right.
And we're rolling.
During the time that the strike was on, these streets were not anything like they are now. They were all potholes. As I remember it, during that period of time, when you came south on Boulevard, which is the street that ran in front of the mill, just as you passed underneath the railroad tracks, there was where they had one station of the Pinkertons, where they had a booth set up there for them. That's where their headquarters were there. Then when you came all the way around, along past the cemetery, and you hit Memorial Drive, right there on the corner, and that was the northeast corner, there was a tent that was pitched by the National Guard, and they had a station there. I don't remember any big number of guards being there like there was, for example, up at Cartersville or down at Noonan or over in Griffin or some of the other places where they had real, well, I'm not familiar with the military sizes of them, but it was a real detachment of them. But that's where they had their guards, and that was their headquarters. If you were traveling through on Boulevard, you had no problem. If you came up a street like Carroll Street or Shelton Street or Gaskell Street or any of these streets in the village, and you were not either a resident here or the people in those houses didn't know you, it didn't take very long until either a Pinkerton man or somebody from the company was trying to find out who you were. There was one more booth on Memorial Drive on the far end of the Elsers property, where they had another station with the Pinkerton people. And there they always had somebody. And by the way, those people were on 24 hours round the clock. It wasn't just manned for certain hours. It was manned round the clock. And if you got in here, you had to belong here or be kin to somebody here or be here on some kind of official business where you knew that you could come and nobody would run you off. Otherwise, they were running you off. If you want to call it a guard camp or a camp where they were patrolling, where they wouldn't let anybody in unless those who belonged, that's what it was.
But you never had a flying squad?
No flying squadron here. The reason there was no flying squadron here is we considered it many times. We figured that it was a waste of time, effort, and energy because these people were so anti-union, so loyal to the paternalistic system that the Elsers people had here, we knew we were wasting our time. We were having trouble getting committees to work, and that's part of the reason why.
How do the houses that are here now condition compare to what was then in terms of...
The houses now show a variety of either porches, back porches, front porches, little gardens, different changes. Other than that, they're pretty much like they were, except that, like if you look at this house here and you see how the paint's crumbling off, there used to be a tremendous number of them like that. And the reason it was is because before they finished repainting them, well, they need to be painted again. And time they went through the village and then came back again, they had all that problem. But all the houses looked alike. I often said that if you drank a little too much and you walked down the street, you might have a difficulty in recognizing your house because they all looked exactly alike.
Okay.
My name is Billy Winn, and this is my hometown of Columbus, Georgia. Over my shoulder you can see the Eagle and Phoenix Mills, one of the oldest mills we have here. It's part of a vast row of mills that line the river here for several miles, all textile mills with the exception of one, a grist mill. They've been here since the 1840s, although you can't really see it in this shot. Immediately behind this mill is the river. And the river and the mills were linked together here in Columbus. The steamships came here to the wharf beginning in 1840 and took both finished products and raw cotton in bales downriver to Apalachicola, and where it was shipped to world ports. At one time or another in Columbus, approximately 25% of the town's population worked in the mills until really shortly before World War II. A high percentage of those were children. Columbus led the nation in the fight against child labor laws, effective child labor legislation, and this was one of the few towns in America where children 12 years of age or younger regularly worked in the cotton mills 66 hours a week alongside their mothers and their fathers and other members of their families. We've had a good deal of labor trouble here over the years, although you can't tell it today. This is an interesting town in that regard. It's a violent little town. It has a history of violence that includes both the labor movement and, of course, racial problems, which are inextricably linked in Columbus. It's an interesting place in that regard, and that's why I'm here to write about the history of the town.
Tell about your own background.
I was born here in the late 30s and grew up here as a boy in the 40s and 50s. I was the son of a doctor who was a city physician, who was himself a transplanted Canadian. And while he was city physician for 20 years or so, part of his responsibilities were to tend the people in the mills who were too poor to, many were too poor to go to private physicians, and so as city physician he saw them, and he established a trade in the mills. And so from the time I was a little child, I grew up with stories of the mills. My father's father worked in this mill here, and also one you can't see further down, the Muskogee Manufacturing Company, as a dye room supervisor. They called him a chemist, but basically all he did was dye some of the finished and semi-finished products. On the other side of my family are mill owners. My mother's side, and mill operatives, management rank, executive rank. So I really have seen the mill story, lived the mill story, I guess you could say, from both sides. This gives you an interesting perspective sometimes. In the 60s and 70s, the 1960s and 70s, most of the mills in Columbus passed out of local family ownership into large corporate ownership. In the 1960s and 70s, most of the mills in Columbus were sold by the local family owners to large corporations, Fieldcrest and so forth. And the mills were somewhat modernized, and you can see from the facade here that the windows of the mill have been closed in, and they've been air conditioned. When I was a boy growing up here, I worked for a while in this mill and in Muskogee Manufacturing Company, and of course they weren't air conditioned at that time. And you could literally see the lint floating in the air, not only in the weave room, but all over the mill, and this entire section of the downtown was covered with cotton lint and stacks of cotton bales all up and down, and cotton warehouses. The facade has changed quite a bit the way this old mill looks. It is an old mill. It was rebuilt immediately after the Civil War. It was destroyed in 1865 by General Wilson, but was immediately rebuilt by the townspeople and has been in operation continuously more or less ever since.
You talk about the lint and your father.
Yeah, let's see. Well, my father spent a good deal of time in these mills, and they were not healthy working environments. There's no question about it. Not only were they very hot, but the lint in the air combined with the moisture, it troubled my father that people were inhaling this sort of stuff. His own father, my grandfather, who worked in the mill, died of pancreatic cancer, and I often wondered if there was not some sort of connection between his work and the mills. But my father, as a physician, saw the conditions in the mills and was very angry about it, and told me stories as a boy about some of the incidents that had happened in the mill. I'm sure they were related to him by his own father as well. They were not very pleasant places to work, even when I was a boy.
Now, you worked in the mill, and you described what it was like.
I just worked in the mill in the summer when I was going to school, so I was never caught in the mills. But I did work in the Muskogee Manufacturing Company here in the paint department. And I got to see the inside of the mills firsthand. We would paint the weave room, and we painted the compressors in the dye room and various other parts of the mill. And even though I knew about the mills, I knew about the conditions in the mill, I was shocked by what I saw. I think anybody would have been. The heat, the discomfort of the workers, the ignorance and the poverty were appalling things to a young boy, and I was no more sensitive than anybody else. I think anybody who had gone into that environment would have felt that way.
Quite vividly what it was like when you breathed in. That's what I want to get.
Yeah. Well, it was like breathing underwater in the weave room. The combination of the linen in the air and the moisture in the lint, which was everywhere, it was almost like inhaling cotton itself. Many of the people that I worked with were in poor health, and I'm sure died very young men. Frequently I worked beside people I thought were 50, 60 years old. It would turn out to be in their 20s, and or I would think somebody would be, 50 years old and would turn out to be 35. So it was quite an experience.
Just grab some cutaways of those windows here. Tell me what the temperature was like and the humidity inside.
Well, of course, in the summertime, the temperature was well over 100 degrees in the weave room. Because the lint tended to drift out of the windows and onto the street, the windows were not entirely open. They had wire screens in them, heavy wire screens, as I remember, and to hold to keep the lint from drifting out. And so the atmosphere and the temperature in there, it was very humid, and it was extremely hot. I have no idea what the temperature was. I never met, but well over 100 degrees, I know, throughout the summer months. I never worked in the mills in the winter, and so I don't know what that was like.